Merhaba arkadaşlar, yeni video karşınızdasınız. Bu video siz her zaman İngilizce öğreniyorsunuz ve bazı sıkıntıları yaşadığını bizim fikirlerimiz ve bizim tecrübelerimiz sizinle paylaşmak istiyoruz. Ve ekranda gördüğün gibi bizim abimiz Yusuf Bey, o kendisi öğretmen ve kendisi YouTube kanalı var. Bu YouTube kanalda orada gittiğin zaman bazı videolar İngilizce geliştirmek için ve bol bol pratik yapmak için orada videolar bulabilirsiniz yani. Şimdi ama biz öncelikle Yusuf, biz İngilizce konuşacağız. You're welcome Yusuf.
Thank you very much, SD.
Thank you, Mr. Yax. Today, as I said, thank you for accepting the invitation. I know that you are a very busy guy and you are also doing your masters as well as you're a teacher. So I know that it's not easy to get someone like you on SD show.
It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm also very happy to be on a show like this. It's always a pleasure.
Let me put my glass. Maybe I can see you very well. So let's just start the program, because the program, I have 7 questions for you. I know that our Turkish brothers really
7 questions.
Yes, 7 questions.
I hope that I'll be able to answer all of them.
No, they are very simple. You know them better than anyone else, so you can answer this question. So our Turkish brothers always want to learn English language, one of the problems that they normally face is that there are some mistakes that they do, which I want you to clarify for them. And one of the questions that I just want us to share your experience back home, how you learned English back home. So how did you learn English back home in Ghana?
Okay, so this is how I learned English back home. You know, when in the classroom, I learned the grammar with the teachers. And when outside the classroom, I tried to practice what I learned in the classroom with my friends. So, and sometimes not only with my friends, but with the teachers. And for example, when the teacher asks a question in the classroom, I try to answer the question with the same things that he has taught us in the class. And this is how I learned English. And yeah, so I could say that I improved my English through practice.
All right. So let's go to the second question. The second question is, how is our system different from Turkish system?
Yeah, first of all, let's start from here. You know, Ghana's education system is, the language of instruction is actually English. So definitely it's going to be it's going to be very different from Turkey, Turkey's one. You know, in Turkey, their language of instruction is Turkish. And that means every subject is going to be in Turkish, except the English language. But if you come to Ghana, all the subject is in English, and that means you are forced to try to improve your English. So this is the main difference between our system.
All right. So how do Turkish people focus much on grammar rather than speaking?
Well, I think for so far, until now, from my experience, I think that Turkish people focus more on grammar. They don't focus on the speaking. Their attention is on the grammar.
Wow. So do they learn purposely for exams?
No, I think this question is kind of connected to the first one, because if they don't focus on speaking, then obviously, if they focus on grammar, then obviously they learn the English for exam. Because because speaking has not, even though grammar supports your speaking, because if you don't know the grammar, how can you speak? Exactly. But I don't think that people will hold you accountable if you don't use good grammar. But for exam, if your grammar is not good, you can fail your exam. Exactly. That's why, since they focus on grammar, then it means they learn this English purposely for exam. So I think, they do that. They learn the English for exam.
All right. So let's go to the 5th one. Do they focus too much on the accent?
This is a good question. And I think, yes, they do. They focus more on accent. And I'm saying this from my own experience.
Yeah.
And not only the students, sometimes even the school that is employing the teachers, they also focus on that. They focus on your accent.
Yeah.
And yeah, and since I'm a teacher, I should know this. They really focus on your accent. If your accent is not good, then forget it. They they don't want to even take things from you, right? So I think that, yeah, Turkish people focus on accents more than the let's say the pronunciation. And I, at this point, I'd like to clarify like the difference between the pronunciation and the accent, since you've asked me this question.
Yeah.
You know, the pronunciation has to do with saying the words how it is meant to be said. I
Yeah.
mean, if you take your dictionary, how it is meant to be said. And accent has to do with like music, the music of the word. So that is why like American English is different from the British English. It doesn't mean Americans have like good English. It doesn't mean that. It's just like Americans try to use their, I mean, they speak their language with some sort of music or rhythm in their language. So I think that they have to focus more on the pronunciation, because no one, when you are outside and you're speaking with a good accent but your pronunciation is not good, then people are not going to understand what you are saying, right? Just
Exactly.
like me trying to speak Turkish. If I want to say NASİL in Turkish, and let's say I don't have a good pronunciation, then Turkish people cannot understand what I'm trying to mean, right?
Yeah.
So I think that a good accent doesn't mean good English. That's what they should know.
All right. Let's go to the safe one. How can they practice on their own?
How can they practice on their own?
Yeah.
First, I think they should set goals. Goal means, why are you learning the language? Are you learning the language because your parents told you to do so, or are you learning it because you want to pass your exam, or are you learning it because you want to travel outside the country, or are you doing it because you want to speak? So setting the goal is the first thing. It's very important, because once you set the goal, you are going to work towards that goal. So if your goal is to pass an exam, then of course no one can prevent you from focusing much on grammar, because if without a grammar you can't pass your exam. And if your goal is is speaking, then of course you have to focus more on expressions, learning more like commonly used expressions, phrases. So I think that that's the first thing. The second thing that I think they can do is they should talk to themselves in English. Why this is so important? It is important because they are in a country where all around them is Turkish. Like everywhere you go is Turkish, and they can't find anyone to practice with.
Yeah.
And so the best person to practice English with is themselves. When they are at home, they try to talk to themselves. And maybe they might not know how to do it. I think this is the best way that they can do it. They can choose a topic. Let's say today they are going to talk about, let's say, environmental pollution, for example. Let's say they are going to talk about the environment. Now they prepare as if they are going to do presentation, and they prepared the topic, they prepare very well. Then they talk to themselves as if they are giving a speech to someone. They prepared on this topic and they talk to themselves. Or they can also prepare it in a form of dialogues. I think recently I gave the same exercise to my student and it really went well. So they were home and I gave them like I think four vocabulary. So I told them that they should use these vocabulary words in dialogues. And some of them, they use this vocabulary, they use these words to even create a story. I was not even expecting that. They use it for story. So when they do that at home, it can really improve their English. And the third that I could say is, while they are speaking, they should try to record their voice, because when you record it and you listen to the voice after you are done speaking, you are actually it is going to help you to know how you sound. Now, right now, I'm speaking with you. I don't know how I sound to you, like hearing my voice. I don't know. I can only know it once I listen to maybe a recording. Let's say I have a camera here and trying to record what I'm saying. And after speaking with you, if I go back and listen to my voice, I will know that, oh, I sound like this, so maybe I could do it in this way next time, right? So it helps you to even shape your pronunciation and accent. That I know that they focus on accent, so it can even help to shape their accent.
Yeah.
So I think that they should try to recall. Let's say someone says better and someone says better. It's like the two is the same word, just that one of them is trying to make it in a way that sounds like, sounds like music, just like rappers, how they rap. So they are trying to make the word sounds like music, but it doesn't mean the one who said better is wrong. And actually, that is the right pronunciation from the dictionary, right? So yeah. And accent, what I could even say about accent is it tells you where the person is coming from.
Exactly.
That's one thing about accent. So if, let's say, I'm speaking Turkish, and let's say the person doesn't see me, I'm speaking off camera, like off video, the person can't see me, but once the person hear me speak, the person can know that this person is a foreigner or Turkish, just from my accent,
Exactly.
because he can know my accent is not like Turkish people, because I don't add that music part of their speaking. I don't add that, you know. So Turkish, let's say I can pronounce the same word, Turkish person can pronounce the same word, but because he adds some sort of music, the pronunciation will be some way that it might sound different, right?
Exactly. Exactly.
So,
It's
for example, we say that ne yapıyorsun, right? By text person, we just say ne yapıyorsun. And if you are someone who's just started learning Turkish, you might be confused. What is this? So, yeah.
It's just like me when I came to Turkey first time. One of my roommates said kochum. So when he said kochum, I quickly go and check the meaning of kochum from the dictionary.
Yeah.
And it means ram.
You see?
So I got very mad. I got furious with this guy. So why are you calling me ram? Why are you calling me ram? So they were trying to explain things to me, but since my mind is fixed from the dictionary, I said, nah, not knowing kochum means my friend.
Yeah. So you see, these things are really important. Like, sometimes you can even see. I even had a problem with someone at school when I was teaching. So the mother came to the school to pick the child, and the child is actually a boy. Then when the mom came, she says, "Hade anejim." I was like, why are you calling? I was saying, why are you calling a boy anejim? Because ane means mother in Turkish, in English. Yeah. So anejim is like my dear mom. So why do you have to call your son my dear mom? Not knowing that they use those things to mean like to show some love. So it's like so they use that one to show love. That means they are trying to show the love of a mother, like how they show love to their parent mom. So maybe this is the type of love they have for the son. So these things like they are very important.
Mr. Yax, Mr. Yusuf, we have come to the end of the show. Thank you for accepting my invitation, and thank you for spending your time with me and to try to share your views with my wonderful Turkish friends and people who want to learn English. So those of you who don't know Mr. Yax, he also has a channel called Mr. Yax. And on his channel, videos with subtitles where you can practice English, or even there's some music that you can even like or learn their lyrics. You can learn that from his channel. Yeah. So guys, check his channel. And Mr. Yax, thank you for joining us. Maybe next time we will invite you again for another show.
I'm really waiting for that day. I'm really happy to be on your channel, and I hope to be with you again another time.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. All right, see you. Görüşürüz.
Görüşürüz.